The public sector along the Pacific West Coast is really showing some tremendous leadership in the adoption of zero-emission vehicles. But can we truly electrify everything in a reasonable time frame? Hey, how's it going? Patrick Brewer here, Plug-in BC's Fleets Advisor, and today I'm joined by Charles from Atlas Policy. We're going to hear about an electrification assessment they did for public sector vehicles in Washington State.
So, hello everyone. My name is Charles Satterfield. I'm a senior project manager with Atlas Public Policy. I'd like to thank you all for having me here today to present the results from our latest report, analyzing electrification of public vehicle fleets in Washington State. First, a bit on the project background. It was a collaborative effort that involved contributions from ourselves at Atlas, the National Renewable Energy Laboratory, and the Washington State University Energy Program. The project was broken down into 6 separate deliverables involving the creation of an inventory of the existing state fleet, along with the current electrification status of that fleet, a comparison of the total cost of ownership of available alternative electric vehicles, projecting the cost of electrification in 2025, 2030, and 2035, determining the required statewide charging network to support an electrified fleet, quantifying the emissions abatement from an electrified fleet, and then finally exploring financing strategies and mechanisms to accelerate the pace of electrification in Washington. With the ultimate goal being to provide Washington with comprehensive vehicle-specific electrification cost estimates, both today and in the future, and to deliver actionable information on how to efficiently move forward with fleet electrification. So now that you've got some background, let's hop into the results, starting with the present-day total cost of ownership analysis. So some brief background on the total cost of ownership analysis. It covered nearly 29,000 vehicles across over 4.2 million scenarios using actual vehicle data from the fleet inventory for state agencies, school districts, and transit agencies, and included variations in things like EV model selection, electricity rates, and charging configuration for each vehicle. Also included were localized emissions estimates for all vehicles. This was performed for the present day in 2020, as well as the future dates of 2025, 2030, and 2035. When defining whether a vehicle should be electrified, we followed the existing rules in the Washington Administrative Code, where any vehicle that had an electric vehicle that was within 5% of the total cost of ownership of its conventional counterpart met the threshold for electrification. However, we further categorize results based on the average difference in total cost of ownership between a conventional and electric vehicle, as you can see in that table on the right there, with anything that was at least 10% cheaper being categorized as very likely to be electrified, and between 10% cheaper and 5% more expensive, we categorize as likely to be electrified, in between 5 and 20% more expensive, we categorize as neither likely nor unlikely. I would like to highlight that the neither likely nor unlikely is kind of the gray area of electrification, if you will, where slight variations in, say, model selection of the electric vehicle or charging configuration could push the procurement one way or the other in terms of whether or not a vehicle should be electrified. And then finally, we calculated results both in an initial and subsequent deployment of EVs, the difference between the two being that in the subsequent deployment of EVs, we discounted the cost of charging infrastructure to reflect the long-term savings potential of electrification once you have a charging network built out and are just replacing vehicles. So now, moving on. So to demonstrate how we arrived at our results, I want to briefly walk through an example of how we calculated the total cost of ownership for each vehicle. So for each of the nearly 29,000 vehicles included in the analysis, we gathered 40 plus data points, including things like vehicle make, model, fuel price, years of ownership, annual mileage, fuel economy, price specific to Washington, and as well as likely charging infrastructure. We then input that data into our fleet procurement analysis tool, which uses a sophisticated financial and environmental model to determine the lifetime total cost of ownership for a given vehicle, including charging infrastructure. The tool then outputs the total cost of ownership along with emissions data, which forms the basis of our results, which I will discuss on the next slide. So from our present day analysis, we found that more than 1,600 vehicles can be electrified cost effectively today, or roughly double the number of electric vehicles currently in the public fleet. Electrifying these vehicles would result in savings of more than $72 million at the 5% threshold, though primarily coming from transit bus electrification. I would like to point your attention to the graph here on the bottom right, which shows the cumulative cost or savings from electrification as you increase the percentage of total vehicles in the fleet that are electrified. One of the things I would like to highlight in our analysis is how, as you move, say, from that figure of 4% electrification with cumulative savings of nearly 80 million to 8% electrification with cumulative savings of nearly 39 million, how fleets could potentially use savings from certain vehicles to subsidize the electrification of vehicles which offer like a less attractive electrification case. If the goal is to significantly advance electrification in the fleet, then you can target very likely cases for savings and then use those savings to cases which are a little further outside the range of an ironclad savings. So though the overall share of the fleet was low at roughly 6% of the fleet, as you can see in the top right there, we found that light-duty vehicles were near the tipping point for large-scale electrification, with small optimizations and things like vehicle selection or charging strategy resulting in large swings in the number of vehicles that could be electrified cost-effectively. In particular, we found that sedans and police vehicles were the most cost-effective light-duty vehicles to electrify, owing to the relative maturity of those markets. For both use cases, there were several mass market models available, like the Chevy Bolt or Model 3, which were much more competitive in terms of upfront pricing. Alternatively, other use cases like pickups, vans, and large SUVs offered or suffered from a lack of options and were primarily limited to expensive luxury models. The results for each type of light-duty vehicle are explored more in detail in the full report for anyone interested. So another encouraging result was for medium and heavy-duty transit vehicles, which were the most cost-effective vehicles to electrify and could generate millions in potential savings. And then finally, as I mentioned previously, the total cost of ownership analysis included variations, things like EV model selection, electricity rate, and charging configuration for each vehicle, which resulted in a range of results. The figures above are reflective of the average across all scenarios for each vehicle, but there was a wide range depending on which scenario you chose, going all the way from 2% of the fleet being electrified cost effectively in the worst case, all the way up to 21% of the fleet being electrified in the best case. And in the following slides, I'm going to speak more about the effects of these variations on the electrification potential of vehicles. We found that prioritizing vehicles with high annual mileage could substantially increase the savings for electrification. Other than price, annual mileage was the most important factor for determining EV cost competitiveness. So the primary way that EVs achieve savings over conventional vehicles is by having lower operating costs in terms of fuel price and maintenance. So the more you drive a vehicle, the more likely you are to achieve a net savings by switching to an EV. And the graph on the right is a breakdown of the likelihood results for all vehicles separated out by annual mileage or percentiles, I should say. You can clearly see how the results improve as annual mileage increases, with average savings per vehicle more than double for each 10th percentile, represented by each of the bands, the graph on the right there, with the difference in savings between vehicles in the 10th and 90th percentile being more than 600 times, though those vehicles in the 90th percentile were in the extreme in terms of annual mileage, upwards of 90,000 miles per year. These were typically long-range transit buses or intercity transit buses. But it played a huge role in whether or not a vehicle had a good case for electrifying. Moving on to EV selection, we found that EV model selection had the most significant effect on the electrification potential of vehicles in the fleet. So in the analyses, we modeled up to 3 different EV models for each vehicle in question, which all of which varied slightly in capabilities and price, though all were chosen such that they met the minimum specifications of the use case. So selecting the lowest cost EV of those 3 could more than double the share of the fleet that can be electrified cost effectively today, and increase total savings from electrification by 60%. So one example of this to highlight the effect was choosing the lower range EV alternative for pickup trucks resulted in an average upfront savings of nearly $30,000, the difference between the lowest price EV pickup truck and the highest priced. And then doing so, if you just narrowed it down to that lowest price vehicle, it quadrupled the number of pickups that could be electrified cost effectively. And all of this requires no change in state policy or allocation of additional funds or passing new laws or any sort of policy. It can all be done just by optimizing the parameters of the procurement. So moving on to some additional findings. We found that unmanaged charging had a significant negative effect on electrification potential of vehicles. So this we modeled by doubling the electricity rate to account for demand charges from charging from large draws on the electric grid. So this is common across utilities, is exceeding a certain demand level of electricity in a given period will result in expensive demand charges. These can be mitigated by smart charging systems. So we've modeled variations in electricity rate to kind of predict the impact of these unmanaged charging where you incur the full cost of demand charges. And then we also found that low-cost charging configurations had the greatest potential influence on light-duty electrification. So as mentioned previously, many vehicles were already on the tipping point for light-duty vehicles. So even small savings from choosing a less expensive charging configuration had a large effect, in this case, triple the number of vehicles that at the electrification threshold. The effect of choice of charging configuration was less pronounced on medium and heavy-duty vehicles, as the charging cost made up a relatively smaller proportion of the total cost of ownership. But it really highlights the importance of proper planning and institution of best practices when charging. The last thing we modeled in the present day was different public policies that the state could implement, and in order to accelerate the pace of electrification in the state. So of the policies listed in the graph on the right there, this is just a subset of the policies we looked at, which are focused on light-duty electrification. We found that level 2 utility infrastructure grants were highly effective in terms of the number of additional electric vehicles that could be purchased cost effectively. So a level 2 utility infrastructure grant just covered the cost of equipment and installation for a level 2 charging system. And if this was done, or if this was funded by utilities, it could be done at low or no cost to Washington. And then additionally, we found that bundled procurements offer a large increase in the number of vehicles at no cost to the state. So the way we modeled this was the state using its negotiating power as a large purchaser to reap the full benefit of existing incentives. In this case, we modeled it as being able to reap the full value of the federal tax credit for EVs, so up to $7,500 per vehicle for qualifying vehicles. And this only targets light-duty vehicles. And one quick thing to note is that this can be claimed by government entities, but the way that that is done is to have the dealership claim the credit themselves and then pass that savings on to the government entity in the form of a lowered vehicle price. And as I said, this only targets light-duty vehicles and comes at no cost whatsoever to the state, and was highly effective at increasing the number of vehicles to electrify. Moving on to the future total cost of ownership projections and substantial electrification of the fleet in the years 2025, 2030, and 2035. First, I want to give some quick background on the future projections of total cost of ownership. As I mentioned previously, we analyzed the electrification potential of vehicles at 3 separate points in the future. For each of those years, we considered 2 technology scenarios, a business as usual scenario and a research and development success scenario. The difference between the two being in a business as usual scenario, the pace of research and development continues somewhat as it is, just kind of at a normal pace. And then in a research development success scenario, we model the effect of hitting research and development targets which have been established by the Department of Energy and their effect on the cost to manufacture vehicles. We also considered 2 EV deployment scenarios, which I mentioned previously, the both initial and subsequent deployment. And then we also looked at 4 different electrification scenarios. So electrify nothing, in which the state chooses to not pursue electrification beyond what it already has done. Electrify selectively, which is where the state electrifies everything within the 5% threshold that has been established. Electrify substantially, which is the state electrifies everything within 20% of the total cost of ownership. And then electrify everything, which is the state just buys electric vehicles regardless of the cost. So moving on to the results, we found that 100% electrification resulted in 2035, I should say, 100% electrification resulted in savings even under the worst case scenario in terms of technological progress and EV deployment. So you'll see there in this graph with the blue being electrify nothing, that strategy, green being electrify selectively, red being electrify substantially, and purple being electrify everything. And in all cases, although it didn't offer necessarily the largest savings, it always resulted in cumulative savings over the pathway of electrifying nothing. These were highly dependent upon the research and development success. So in the worst case, savings was 250 million, roughly. And then in the best case, it ranged all the way up to more than 3.4 billion. And this also assumes that the current policy landscape in Washington is unchanged. So that all policies which are on the books stay as they are, but nothing new is added that could even accelerate the pace of electrification. So this slide focuses on the results from all vehicles across the entire fleet, but on the next slide, I want to hone in on light-duty results in particular. So we found that 70% of light-duty vehicles become cost competitive in 2035, even under the worst-case assumptions. So that would be an initial deployment of EVs and the 5% threshold. Discounting charging infrastructure, however, raises that share of fleet that the share of the fleet that can be electrified cost effectively to over 90% in just 2025, which really highlights, as I mentioned before, the kind of tipping point nature of light duty vehicles, where even small shifts in the total cost of ownership result in large changes in the number of vehicles that can be electrified cost effectively. Overall, though, we found that research development success was less relevant for light duty vehicles, as many of the vehicles, like I said before, sedans and police vehicles were already largely cost competitive. So additional advancements in, say, battery technology were less relevant compared to medium and heavy duty vehicles. Moving on to our recommendation based upon these results. We recommended that the state should consider developing a roadmap to swiftly increase the share of EVs in the public fleet between 2020 and 2035 to achieve billions in potential cost savings. So as I mentioned before, the savings range between 250 million to 3.4 billion, depending on the scenario in question. One thing is for certain is that electrification achieves cost savings. And the analysis shows that all vehicles should be electric, or at least could be electric by 2035. And we feel that this puts real weight behind a lot of the movement in state level policy that we're seeing across the nation in terms of movement towards electrification, states considering banning the sale of internal combustion vehicles. And we feel as though that this really puts weight behind those decisions. It shows that those decisions aren't necessarily done at a cost to consumers, but could be done at a savings. Moving on to just summarize the report. So these conclusions were drawn from in-depth, individualized total cost of ownership analysis for nearly 29,000 vehicles. It covers all aspects of e-procurement, from the purchase of the vehicle on through charging infrastructure and emissions abatement. We also includes a detailed analysis of policy effects on EV cost competitiveness, with over 4.2 million scenarios being considered, which are available for exploration and analysis by the audience via online dashboards, which are available at our website, atlaspolicy.com. And finally, this research informed development of Atlas's new free fleet analysis tool, DRFE Drive, which empowers users to do their own vehicle-by-vehicle fleet analysis and be able to recreate the results of this report for any fleet in which they're interested. That wraps it up for me. I'd like to thank everybody again for having me here today. And if you have any questions regarding the report, please feel free to email me. My email is listed down there in the bottom right. Happy to answer any questions, and thank you again.